I think it's safe to say that a lot of us dream of one day owning a supercar. Whether you were a kid dreaming of owning a Lamborghini or a Ferrari, maybe a Porsche or a McLaren, pretty much everyone wants a supercar at some point in their life, but unfortunately supercars are very expensive, as you probably know. Luckily, there are some supercars which have depreciated a massive amount, and now they're an absolute bargain for the performance that you get. So today we're going to cover the best supercars and the cheapest supercars that you can buy. Not too surprisingly, one of the first supercars that we're going to list is the Audi R8, but not just any R8 specifically. We're going to talk about the V8 powered R8. And while it might not be as powerful or as good sounding as the V10 powered R8, there's a reason that we're going to pick the V8 R8, which is it's much cheaper. And it's much cheaper because it's simply less desirable than the V10 powered R8. So if you don't mind having a V8 over a V10, you're going to end up with a much cheaper option. R8 was originally released in 2006, and it's based on the same platform as the Lamborghini Gallardo and Huracan, though it is considerably less flashy in its styling than both of those. That's definitely not a bad thing if you prefer a supercar that's a little bit more low-key than a loud yellow Lambo, but it's still a lot more interesting than something like your everyday Honda Civic. While it might not be as good as the V10 models, the V8 R8 still outputs 414 horsepower and 317 pound-feet of torque, and all that power is put to the ground through Audi's all-wheel drive Quattro system. All these things combined help propel the V8 R8 from 0 to 60 in around 4.4 seconds and the quarter mile in around 12.5 seconds with a top speed of about 187 miles an hour. That's a pretty insane amount of performance considering you can pick one of these up for around $40,000 to $50,000. I mean, you can do 187 in something that costs about the same as the Civic Type R. It's a pretty good bargain, but unfortunately there is a reason that they're super cheap, and one, they're not desirable, but two, the V8 engine is not nearly as reliable and it carries very high maintenance costs. So if you pick up one of these, be prepared to dump a lot of money into it with maintenance. If you're a little bit more daring and you're willing to buy something that might end up killing you, the Dodge Viper is definitely the way to go. It's super cheap, it's got a V10 engine, and depending on which model you get, it might not kill you, but some of them are pretty gnarly. Depending on how much money you're willing to spend and how much risk you're willing to take on, you could either go for a first gen or a second gen Viper. You could even go for a third or fourth gen, but the first and second gen are definitely the best value. The first gen Vipers are really cheap now, but they have zero driving aids and a lot of power in a very tough to drive path. This has caused a lot of the first gen Vipers to be crashed, and a lot of people fear driving them, but that makes them even cheaper. Under the hood of the first gen Viper, you'll find an 8-liter V10. It's naturally aspirated and outputs around 400 horsepower and 465 pound-feet. It lacks any sort of sophisticated all-wheel drive system, so acceleration performance theoretically is relatively limited, although the giant 335 wide rear tires help make up for that. You can hit 0 to 60 in one of these first gen Vipers in around 4.5 seconds, and the quarter mile is around 12.5 seconds, which, if you were paying attention, it's really similar to the V8 powered R8. But unlike the V8 R8, you can find one of these first gen Vipers for as little as $30,000 to $35,000, sometimes even as low as $25,000 if you know where to look. Quite frankly, a lot of old Ferraris have depreciated really badly because they really don't offer a huge amount of performance compared to modern supercars, and they carry very high maintenance costs. But the specific Ferrari we're going to look at is a Ferrari 355, which was available from 1994 to 1999, and it was essentially a much nicer and heavily revised version of the Ferrari 348. If you ever talk to an F355 owner, you'll hear them go on and on about how it's near perfection as far as performance combined with the sound and the design and the driving experience, but the dreams of the absolute perfect 1990 supercar go out the window when you realize just how expensive it is to maintain one of these. Luckily for you and me, the 355 is one of the worst depreciating modern Ferraris ever built. Part of the 355's depreciation issue is that despite its absolutely gorgeous looks and amazing sounding 375 horsepower 3.5 liter V8, the next two mid-engine V8 Ferraris are significantly more powerful and more reliable. The 360 is much curvier and much more modern looking, and the 430 is even more modern looking than that. Now, in 2013, Ferrari 355 prices had bottomed out around $37,000 as the average, but they've since gone up to around $50,000 since then, and that's probably because one, people realized how cheap they were and they were buying them up like crazy, and two, in 2013 the economy was still sort of feeling the effects of the 2008 financial crisis. Since then, a lot of values have gone up. For a lot of enthusiasts, the Porsche 911 isn't exactly a supercar as much as it is a high-end sports car, unless you're talking about the GT3 or the GT3 RS, which have the wild looks and everyone knows that they're crazy on track, but the Porsche 911 Turbo flies kind of under the radar because it has a much tamer looks. Looks are very similar to a base 911 unless you know what you're looking for, but it offers insane amounts of performance. Porsche revealed the 996 Turbo at the Frankfurt Auto Show in September of 1999. At the time that it came out, the $110,000 turbo model was the fastest street legal Porsche available. It was capable of hitting a top speed of 191 miles an hour. Unfortunately, good quality 996 turbos have started to appreciate in value since reaching the absolute bottom of their depreciation, but it's been a very slow climb over the last few years. Average prices are around $42,000, which really isn't that much considering you're buying something that's capable of nearly 200 miles an hour in stock form and can easily have its power massively increased with some basic bolt-ons and a tune. If you think about it, $42,000 isn't really that far off of a Nismo 370Z. Which one would you rather have? A brand new Nismo 370Z or a 200 mile an hour capable Porsche? As I'm sure a lot of you guys know, the first generation NSX pretty much completely changed the supercar market back in the 1990s. Ever since then, supercars have not been the same. And that's because the NSX set the standard of what a supercar should be in terms of reliability. At the time that it came out, it was able to compete with the Italian and German supercars that were in its class, but it offered way better reliability, which made it pretty popular. With front and rear double wishbone suspension accompanied by forged control arms, the NSX placed second in Road & Track's 1990 handling test, going up against cars like the 911 Carrera 4 and the Ferrari 355 Spider. It was really on par with the performance of the Italian and German supercars at the time. But strangely enough, it's depreciated pretty poorly for something which was once battling the best foreign supercars of the time. You can find an early NSX model for as low as $25,000. Think about that. You can get a mid-engine Ferrari killing 1990s beast for the same price as a brand new Honda Civic Si. Depending on the model that you purchase, it'll have around 270 horsepower from its 3-liter V6, which doesn't sound like supercar levels of performance, but when you consider that it weighed just over 3,000 horsepower and had an exceptional chassis, it kind of makes up for it. Now this next car kind of walks the line between a high-end sports car and a supercar, and that's the Aston Martin V8 Vantage. It hauls ass, it looks awesome, and it sounds great, and best of all, it's really cheap now. You can find a used V8 Vantage for as low as $40,000, which is pretty insane considering a lot of them cost upwards of $120,000 when they were brand new. One of the most impressive things about the Vantage is its great feel behind the wheel. The aluminum space frame structure is super rigid, and compared to a lot of other cars in its categories, the Vantage had a distinct, very strong feeling chassis, which gave it a unique driving experience. Designed by the legendary Henrik Fisker to compete with the trend-setting supercars like the Porsche Carrera, the Vantage had a personality of its own, and the design has aged incredibly well. I mean, if you look at a V8 Vantage, it doesn't look dull or boring at all, which isn't really something you can say about all cars which came around at that time. Depending on the model that you're looking at, power and price is going to be different, but if we looked at a 2011, for example, power output's going to be around 420 to 430 horsepower, with around 360 pound-feet of torque. All of that combined lets that V8 Vantage fly from 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds, all for the low price of around $40,000. At its launch in 2007, the Maserati Gran Turismo kind of promised to be the car that could take on the Porsche 911. It had the looks, it had the styling, it had the sound, it had the performance, and it had a price to match. And it did actually compete super well with the Porsche 911 right up until there were a huge amount of recalls, which kind of damaged its reputation. And most of the recalls had to do with the electronics, transmission, and gearbox, and they really didn't actually damage its reputation. But since then, a lot of people haven't looked at the Gran Turismo quite the same. One of the best features of the Maserati Gran Turismo is the interior, and although it lacks some features that other cars of the time had, such as Bluetooth, it is easily the roomiest 4-seater supercar on this list. It might not look like it from the outside, considering it really is not that massive of a car, but 2 adults can fit in the back seat, and it's a really comfortable car for a long road trip. If you're somebody who wants a cheap supercar that can go long distances, the Maserati Gran Turismo is probably your most comfortable option. If you hop on eBay, you can find quite a few of these Maserati Gran Turismos for around $35,000, but the average price is going to be around $45,000 to $50,000, which really isn't that bad. You're getting a lot of performance in a very luxurious car for the money. Now this next car, although it's not technically a supercar, it carries super low maintenance costs compared to every other car on this list, and it performs with the best of them, and that's the C5 Z06. And I know what you're thinking, it's just another Corvette, and the C5 Z06 really isn't even as great as the C6 Z06. But bear with me, the performance really matches a lot of the other cars on this list, and it has a price to match. The C5 Z06 features a lightweight 5.7 liter LS6 engine, makes 385 horsepower, but that was later increased to around 405 horsepower. It features upgraded suspension, along with larger wheels, better tires, and better brakes compared to the standard C5 Corvette. Chevy engineers lowered the weight of the C5 Z06 by fitting a titanium exhaust to it, reducing soundproofing, and even equipping the Z06 with a lighter battery. These improvements allow the C5 Z06 to run from 0 to 60 in around 4 seconds and hold nearly 1 G in corners, which is pretty much better than any other Italian or German supercar offered at the time. To put it simply, the C5Z outperformed nearly every performance vehicle in its category when it came out. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, a lot of people are just going to look at it like a C5 Corvette. It's kind of basic. It hasn't aged super well. It has flip-up headlights, which I think are cool, but they haven't aged super well. And it's, a lot of people are just not going to consider it a supercar, even though it has the performance to rival pretty much every other car on this list. Luckily for you and me, the C5 Z06 has gotten really cheap, and you can find them for as low as $25,000, which, in case you were curious, is about the price of a brand new Fiesta ST. For a lot of enthusiasts, myself included, when you hear the name Lotus, you immediately think of the Elise. Sure, Lotus makes other cars, but nobody seems to care about them. The Elise is what they're best known for because it offered so much performance in such a tiny package with such a good price that it almost didn't even seem real. While the Elise is awesome, they haven't really depreciated much lower than their original value because the Elise was pretty much dirt cheap in the first place. Now, because the Elise hasn't depreciated that much and it's really not all that comfortable, it's more of a driving toy than a car that you would want to use every single day, we're going to go with the Lotus Evora in this case. You can find newer models in much better shape than some of the Elises that are available, and the styling and creature comforts are far superior than anything the Elise has to offer. With examples going back as far as 2009, this small and sporty supercar boasts brand new horsepower range of around 240 to 257 horsepower. And I know what you might be thinking, 240 to 257 horsepower, really not all that much, especially considering that the Evora is larger than the Elise. But you got to remember, the Evora is still a lightweight car. It might not be as lightweight as the Elise, but it's still very light for a mid-engine supercar. The Evora hasn't depreciated as bad as some of the vehicles on this list, but you can find a decent used one for around $40,000, maybe $50,000. That's a lot of performance for your money, and it might not be as fast or as flashy as some of the other cars on this list, but the Evora is still a great option if you're looking for a cheap used supercar. Alright guys, that's pretty much all I've got for you guys today. I know some of these cars were kind of sports cars and not supercars, but all of them are really great looking, really great sounding, have a lot of performance, and they've depreciated enough where it's kind of a good value to buy one compared to buying one brand new. If there's any cars you guys think I should have added to this list, let me know down in the comments below. Smash that thumbs up button because it helps put this video in front of more people. Subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one.